the most shocking sexual practices of Native Americans. When the first colonists wrote about Native peoples, their reports carried both fascination and fear. They described rituals that blended sexuality, spirituality, and survival in ways so shocking. But peel away the prejudice, and a different story emerges, one where shock turns into meaning. What did they really see? Stick to the end of the video because the sexuality twist will challenge everything you thought you knew about what's normal. You may be asking, why care about rituals from centuries ago? Because history often reshapes itself to suit the storyteller. When Europeans met Native peoples, they didn't just trade goods, they traded judgments. What was sacred to one world was scandal to the other. For Native communities, sexuality was tied to survival and spirit. For colonists, it belonged behind locked doors. So why revisit this now? Because normal is never universal. What shocks one culture may sustain another. And history reminds us that a little humility, and perhaps a sense of humor, goes a long way. To understand why these practices mattered, we need to step inside their world. Native America was never one story, but a patchwork of nations, each with its own ways of weaving sexuality into life and ceremony. For them, the body was not shameful, but sacred, a vessel connecting people, spirits, and the land. For outsiders, this was overwhelming. For the communities themselves, it was order. And in that clash of perspectives, sacred practice became scandal. Before we dive into the first ritual, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think outsiders found most shocking? The ceremonies, the freedoms, or the rules? Drop a comment below, and let's see what surprises you the most. Take fertility rituals, for example. Men and women might enact symbolic couplings, not as entertainment, but as living metaphors of creation. The union of sky and earth, rain and soil, seed and harvest. Outsiders who stumbled upon these ceremonies often blushed, scowled, or reached for their quills to write scandalized reports. Yet, to the participants, every gesture, every chant, every movement of the body was sacred theater, an offering to unseen forces that govern their lives. Let's look at a scenario where Native people are arriving at a harvest festival in such a community. The evening air is alive with smoke and drumming. Dancers painted with ash and ochre circle great fires, their bodies glistening in the flicker of light. Their chants rise and fall like waves. To the uninitiated, it might seem chaotic, even wild. But to those within the circle, it was choreography of the oldest kind, an ancient dialogue with nature, asking for rain, protection, or abundance in the seasons ahead. This is where misunderstanding crept in. Colonists, raised in societies where sexuality was cloaked in secrecy and often policed by church and state, saw only impropriety. They missed the meaning. To them, what was sacred looked obscene. To the dancers, what was essential looked obvious. The human body was simply another tool for prayer, no different from smoke, song, or drumbeat. And here lies the real shock, not in the acts themselves, but in the interpretation. One world viewed these rituals as indecency, the other saw them as reverence. In truth, the ceremonies were neither reckless nor chaotic. They were structured, intentional, and deeply tied to survival. If you take away the prejudice, you see not scandal, but a profound reminder. For these communities, creation itself was sacred, and to embody it was to honor life. But the story of sexuality didn't end with ritual. Wait till you see how it extended into identity itself. Sexuality in Native communities was not confined to ritual alone. It was also deeply tied to questions of identity. Among many nations, there were people whom we now refer to as Two-Spirit. The term is modern, but the concept is ancient. These were individuals who moved between what we would call masculine and feminine roles, sometimes fluidly, sometimes permanently. To them, there was no contradiction. To their societies, there was no scandal. To an outsider steeped in European norms, however, this was bewildering. Colonists came from a world where men were expected to be rigidly masculine and women firmly feminine, with little tolerance for variation. Anything else was branded as deviant or unnatural. Imagine the look on a missionary's face when he discovered that not only were such individuals accepted in Native communities, but they were also revered. It must have scrambled his categories so thoroughly that he didn't know whether to reach for his Bible or his journal first. Within Native societies, Two-Spirit people often held vital roles. They were healers, gifted with knowledge of both men's and women's worlds. They were matchmakers, bridging relationships with a sense of balance others admired. Many were storytellers and keepers of oral history, entrusted with preserving traditions because they were seen as carrying unique spiritual insight. Far from being marginalized, they were honored as embodiments of harmony, walking reminders that human identity could reflect the complexity of the universe itself. European chroniclers, however, saw only through their own narrow lens. They wrote of sin and perversion, but in doing so, they missed the point entirely. What Native communities saw was not deviance, but balance. Two-Spirit individuals stood at the crossroads of human possibility, proof that identity could be expansive rather than confined. And if identity challenged European assumptions, wait till you see the way marriage worked in many Native nations. Marriage in Native societies rarely looked like the rigid model familiar to Europeans. It came with surprises that baffled colonists and challenged their assumptions. In some tribes, men could indeed take multiple wives, a practice not uncommon across many ancient cultures, from the Middle East to Asia. But what truly startled European eyes was not polygamy. It was the degree of freedom and authority women held within their marriages. Among the Iroquois, for instance, women were not silent partners. They were decision makers, property holders, and, quite often, the final word in family matters. A marriage could begin at her choosing, but more importantly, it could end just as easily. If a wife no longer wanted her husband in her home, she did not need lawyers, courtrooms, or a lengthy list of grievances. She simply gathered his belongings and placed them outside the lodge. That quiet act spoke louder than any argument. The marriage was finished. No paperwork, no jury, no long wait for approval. Just a practical, decisive gesture. Now imagine the colonist who observed this for the first time. Back in Europe, divorce was so rare it might as well have been a myth. The Catholic Church forbade it. Protestant states allowed it only under extraordinary circumstances. And even then, it could ruin reputations and drag on for years. To a man raised in that environment, the sight of a woman calmly asserting her independence, no fuss, no shame, must have been more shocking than the harshest winter storm. But for Native women, this autonomy was not scandal. It was sovereignty. Their marriages were partnerships, not prisons. A woman's right to dissolve a union was rooted in the recognition that her well-being, her household, and her role in the community mattered as much as a man's. The stability of the tribe depended on balance, not control. It's worth remembering that many Native societies were matrilineal, meaning descent and property passed to the mother's line, not the father's. In such systems, women held considerable influence. They managed the homes, oversaw the crops, and guided councils. Marriage, then, was not about surrendering freedom, but about maintaining harmony. European observers, of course, could only interpret this through their own cultural lens. To them, it looked like chaos. Women unruly, men powerless, society upside down. They saw scandal where there was actually order. They mistook equality for disorder, and sovereignty for rebellion. And here is the subtle lesson. Marriage was not simply about romance or survival, but about the structure of community itself. In these societies, granting women freedom within marriage reinforced the strength of the whole. Colonists could scarcely comprehend this, but Native women lived it daily. So when we look back, the true shock is not that some men had multiple wives, or that some women dismissed their husbands with a symbolic eviction notice. The real surprise is that centuries ago, these societies practiced a level of marital autonomy and gender balance that many cultures are still struggling to achieve today. But even in a world of freedoms, there were firm boundaries, and crossing them came with consequences that might surprise you even more. Among some groups, adultery could result in public shaming. Imagine a husband or wife exposed before the village, their wrongdoing not whispered about in corners, but displayed openly. In other communities, the punishment was more symbolic, yet still effective. The guilty party might have their hair cut short, a mark of disgrace in societies where hair carried spiritual and social meaning. Others faced ritual penalties, designed less to destroy than to correct and remind. To the European observer, this was puzzling. How could a society that celebrated fertility rituals and honored sexual diversity also enforce strict rules about fidelity and kinship? It seems like contradiction. But in truth, it was a balance. Liberty paired with accountability. Native communities recognized that personal freedom could not survive without responsibility. One could say they had a practical wisdom about it. Enjoy your freedoms, but don't abuse them. It's the same principle that keeps traffic lights working. Everyone is free to drive, but chaos erupts if no one respects the red light. The same applied here. Sexuality was respected, but it was framed by rules that protected families, kinship networks, and community order. Colonists, however, often misread this balance. Accustomed to rigid systems where most deviation was condemned as sin, they viewed native laws as inconsistent. To them, either sexuality should be strictly policed, or not at all. They missed the nuance that openness and restriction could coexist in harmony. The lesson here is simple, but powerful. Freedom is never absolute. The natives understood that liberty without boundaries soon collapses into disorder. Their laws, though different from European codes, reflected a living system of justice. They could honor diversity and still demand accountability. And perhaps that was the real shock to outsiders. A society that managed both, and managed it well. But the greatest shock was yet to come. Then came the arrival of Europeans, missionaries, traders, and settlers, each carrying not only goods and weapons, but also deeply rooted assumptions. When they encountered native traditions around sexuality, their reactions were swift and severe. Priests saw ceremonies and identities that defied their teachings and concluded, almost at once, that the people practicing them were ungodly. For colonists raised in a world of strict church doctrine and rigid family structures, these customs seemed like evidence of moral collapse. But here's the key. What they saw was not what was there. Through their reports, rituals that once held profound spiritual meaning were described in lurid detail, stripped of context, and turned into caricatures. What had been sacred was rewritten as scandal. The written word, powerful in European society, became a weapon. With every exaggerated tale, native communities were further painted as savage, giving colonists the excuse they needed to justify conquest, control, and forced assimilation. It's worth pausing here. Imagine the scene. A European scribe hunched over his parchment, recording what he thought he saw, perhaps with a touch of dramatic flair because, after all, sensational stories traveled faster than measured ones. His readers back home, already curious about the new world, devoured these accounts without question. A ritual of fertility became debauchery. A two-spirit healer became a deviant. Nuance vanished, replaced by moral outrage. To native peoples, this misinterpretation was not just insulting, it was dangerous. Traditions tied to survival, balance, and identity suddenly became evidence in the case against their own humanity. It is one of history's bitter ironies. Practices rooted in harmony with the earth were weaponized as proof of chaos. And here lies the real shock. It was never the acts themselves that carried scandal. It was the lens through which they were viewed. Europeans saw sin where there was ceremony, corruption where there was continuity. The distortion did not arise from the practices, but from the prejudice of the observer. Looking back, it's a reminder that misunderstanding can be more destructive than any weapon. In this case, it paved the way for conquest and erasure. Not because of what native peoples did, but because of how their lives were rewritten on European terms. Yet the story doesn't end in loss, because today, those same traditions are rising again, carrying lessons the modern world can't afford to ignore. Fast forward to the present. Across native communities, something remarkable is happening. Traditions that were once silenced, mocked, or even outlawed are being remembered and reclaimed. What earlier generations had to hide for survival is now, little by little, being honored again as part of a living cultural identity. Take two-spirit identity, for instance. For centuries, European colonists and later government systems tried to erase it. Boarding schools, church programs, and assimilation policies pressed native youth to conform to rigid European gender roles. Yet the memory of two-spirit individuals never fully vanished. Today, in many Native nations, two-spirit roles are once again being celebrated. At powwows and community gatherings, you'll find not only the traditional dances and songs, but also special spaces and recognition for those who embody both masculine and feminine spirits. It is a revival that is both cultural and deeply personal, restoring dignity where it was once denied. The same is true of rituals once condemned as scandalous. What missionaries described as immoral has been reframed, not as shameful, but as symbols of resilience. A fertility dance, a coming-of-age ceremony, or an honoring of body and spirit is now seen for what it always was, an act of continuity, a way of tying the present to the past. When a community brings back a suppressed ceremony, they are not simply reviving an old tradition. They are making a declaration. We survived. Our voices, our practices, our meanings, they are still here. For those of us watching from the outside, these revivals do more than enrich history. They hold up a mirror. They ask uncomfortable but necessary questions. What do we, in our modern world, still call taboo? What topics do we shuffle under the carpet because they unsettle our sense of normal? And how will future generations look back on our choices? Perhaps with the same disbelief we now feel when reading old colonial accounts. Think about it. A few centuries ago, the idea that women could end a marriage on their own terms shocked Europeans to their core. Today, divorce is a matter of paperwork. 200 years ago, recognizing gender fluidity was condemned. Now, debates about identity fill our headlines. It is easy to laugh at the narrow-mindedness of the past. But if history teaches anything, it's that our own blind spots will one day be just as obvious. Here is where humor meets humility. Imagine for a moment what our descendants might say about us. They had smartphones in their pockets, but still argued about who should love whom. Or, they lived in a world of abundance, yet they burned through their resources as if there was no tomorrow. The thought is uncomfortable, but it is also clarifying. Just as colonists mistook sacred practices for scandal, we too may be misjudging what truly matters. And this is the deeper relevance. The practices that once scandalized colonists were not evidence of chaos, but of a worldview that embraced body and spirit as inseparable. They understood the human body not as something to hide, but as something to honor. Rituals gave structure to desire. Laws gave limits to freedom. And the result was a balance that worked for their communities. In other words, they had already solved problems we are still trying to sort out. How to respect identity, how to balance freedom with responsibility, and how to see the sacred in everyday life. For modern societies, this isn't just history, it's a gentle challenge. Can we learn from those who came before? Can we imagine a culture where sexuality is not weaponized, where diversity is not condemned, and where ritual connects us instead of dividing us? These are not abstract questions. They are urgent ones, touching everything from how we educate our children to how we legislate our laws. The beauty of revisiting these stories is that they invite perspective. They remind us that what is considered shocking, scandalous, or taboo is not fixed. It shifts with time, with culture, with the stories we choose to believe. What once horrified outsiders is now understood as wisdom. And perhaps one day, the things that still divide us will be seen the same way, not as threats, but as expressions of the fullness of human life. So when we hear of ceremonies, dances, or identities that made colonists recoil, it's worth pausing. Not to laugh at their discomfort, but to recognize our own. History does not just tell us who people were, it tells us who we are, and more importantly, who we might yet become. So here's the truth. The real shock wasn't in the rituals, the marriages, or even the laws themselves. It was in the way two worlds, Native and European, could look at the very same human acts and tell completely different stories. One saw scandal, the other saw ceremony. One saw sin, the other saw survival. Now I want to hear from you. Which part surprised you most? The sacred rituals, the freedoms in marriage, or the rules that kept it all in balance? Let me know in the comments, because your perspective adds to the story. And if you've enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. That way, you won't miss the next time we uncover a piece of history that still has something to teach us today. Because history isn't just about what people did. It's about what we choose to see. and what we choose to remember.